Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey. In this video, I will cover the chapter of the book devoted to principle number 4, which is titled Principle number 4, Why Worldviews Commit Suicide. And you know, Worldview Suicide was almost the name of my Christian-themed Pearl Jam tribute band, but I decided to abandon it and start a YouTube channel instead because I can't sing or play instruments or read music, but it was a dream of mine for a brief time. Anyway, so Pearcey opens this chapter with a question. Do Christians have to check their science at the church door? Not if it's Christian science. She quotes from an interview she conducted with neurosurgeon Michael Egnor, who once believed that Christianity was incompatible with a scientific view of the world. Egnor realized that his scientific materialism wasn't all he'd cracked it up to be when he began studying blood flow to the brain and realized that it had all the hallmarks of a designed system. Pearcey widens out from Egnor and cites Michael Ruse and then Charles Darwin, both of whom have written of how much of what we see in biology has the appearance of design, which is why scientists often use the language of design to describe it, but it isn't actually the product of design. This, of course, was one of the insights that Darwin popularized in the 19th century. Things in nature often look designed, but they're not. It only appears that they are designed. There's an appearance or an illusion of design in nature. Pearcey, of course, sees things a little differently. She says, quote, as we saw in principle number 3, the phrase as if signals cognitive dissonance. It indicates that certain ideas are inescapable in practice, no matter what a person's worldview says. When a concept, such as design, has to be assumed in order to understand living systems, that is a clue that it is a part of general revelation. Well, she says, as we saw in principle number 3, as though she proved anything in that previous chapter. All she's done so far throughout this book is to make unsupported assertions and to misunderstand the philosophies that she's arguing against. So she hasn't actually proven or shown anything in principle number 3 or indeed in any of the chapters we've reviewed so far. And actually, here's another example of her misunderstanding the philosophies or the theories to which she is responding. It's not that design has to be assumed to understand living systems. It's that living systems have the superficial appearance of design. Therefore, it's just easier to speak about them in those terms. It just makes sense to use the language of design to describe and to understand living systems with the understanding, the underlying understanding that they aren't actually designed. And why does that make sense? Well, one reason is that it's just the way our brains work. We see patterns. We instinctively impose designs on things, even if they turn out to not actually be designed. It influences how our thoughts and our languages are constructed. It influences a great deal of how we view the world, of how we approach things when we're trying to figure things out. So we might as well just go with it rather than constantly fighting against it. Another reason is provided by Michael Ruse in a quote which Pearcey includes in this chapter. Ruse explains that approaching living systems as though they were designed enables us to determine how they work by deconstructing them, by sort of reverse engineering them, and learning what purpose each component of the system serves and how all the components come together to operate as a whole. But again, this is all to be done with the underlying understanding that these systems are not actually designed. We approach them with the assumption that they're designed, and we deconstruct them on that basis, but we're always keeping the underlying knowledge that they are not actually designed. They have the appearance of design, and we are assuming the language of design as a convenience for ourselves. Yet again, Pearcey quotes material from someone she is arguing against, then goes on to display a serious misunderstanding of what they said in the passage that she quotes. She insists that treating natural systems as if they were designed necessarily indicates that they were designed. And she ignores the alternative explanation offered by Ruse, which she herself quotes. as to why it makes sense to use the language of design to understand things which we know were not actually designed but only appear that way. Back to Egnor, eventually he decided that the reason living systems look designed is because they are designed. And indeed that blood vessel construction in the brain, the system that channels blood to the brain, is often cited by intelligent design advocates like Nancy Pearcey as an irreducibly complex system. So it kind of makes sense in the context of an intelligent design creationism sort of worldview that Egnor would come to this point of view after being just completely stumped by the construction of blood vessels to the brain, because that is often cited as one of those supposedly irreducibly complex biological systems. Well, concluding that living systems are designed led Egnor to another conclusion, that he had to accept Christianity. So that's what he did, because he's a scientist, and he follows the facts wherever he goes. Seriously, that's what it says in the book. Of course, Pearcey does not include anecdotes from any of the many scientists who followed the facts and concluded that Christianity was completely implausible, or any of the many scientists who determined that their religious beliefs could coexist with scientific fact without ignoring or denying important sections of the latter, or by pretending that things are actually designed when they aren't. It's the facts lead to Christianity, period, version of the story, which again makes sense from a persuasive point of view. Pearcey's job here in this book is to speak to her Christian audience and to reassure them about their beliefs and to arm them to be warriors for Christ. But in terms of honesty and sort of the down the middle, tough, rigorous intellectual examination of these issues that Pearcey occasionally will claim that she is doing, it doesn't hold up to that standard at all, because she picks one guy who found something he thought was irreducibly complex and became a Christian as a result of that. And she says, see, that's what happens. That's what happens when you follow the facts. You conclude that Christianity has to be true. And she pretends that all the people who have not reached that same conclusion just don't exist. That doesn't happen. Pearcey returns to the method which Norman Geisler and Frank Turek named the Roadrunner tactic in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which consists of showing an argument to be self-defeating. And this is how worldviews commit suicide, Pearcey tells us, citing fellow apologist Greg Koukl. When a non-biblical worldview's own criteria are applied to itself, it slits its own throat. Lovely. Pearcey acknowledges that some people consider the Roadrunner tactic to be merely a rhetorical trick designed to shut down conversation. But she insists that this is not the case. She also insists that Christianity cannot be dismissed by using such an argument because, unlike all other worldviews, Christianity is not self-refuting. Right, it's not self-refuting, but only because it's practically unfalsifiable. Anytime you point out an apparent contradiction, there's always an explanation, even if the explanation is, his ways are higher than our ways, or in other words, this actually does make sense, it's just that we're too simple to understand it. If you start with the assumption that your worldview is 100% consistent, and you refuse to accept any suggestion to the contrary, then naturally you'll believe that it isn't self-refuting, which is the place that Nancy Pearcey finds herself. So, principle number 4 then, the actual principle. The principle itself is test the idol. Does it contradict itself? Here's why the Roadrunner tactic, which of course Pearcey doesn't call it the Roadrunner tactic, that is Norman Geisler and Frank Turek's gimmick. She refers to it as the argument from self-referential absurdity. And she says it is not merely a rhetorical trick because it works. And one example of how it works that she gives is that it brought down logical positivism, a philosophy which regarded statements not able to be tested empirically as meaningless. But if only empirically testable statements are meaningful, how can the statement only empirically testable statements are meaningful, which is not empirically testable, be meaningful? She's got you there, empirical or logical positivists. So when those logical positivists realized that, their heads just all exploded. And Pearcey quotes William Lane Craig, who called the fall of logical positivism the most important philosophical event of the 20th century. Pearcey said it was monumental because logical positivism had been so influential for such a long time. And this also recalls Norman Geisler, who bragged in an early chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist that he disproved logical positivism with a single sentence in a philosophy class. Logical positivism was only embraced by philosophers in certain circles for a few decades, from the 1920s to the 1960s, before it largely fell out of favor. So I think Pearcey is wildly overrating the scope and influence of logical positivism, perhaps because it makes her argument from self-referential absurdity seem like a powerful and legitimate argumentative tool rather than the shallow rhetorical trick that it actually is. And I would just like to point out she offers no evidence to substantiate that the argument from self-referential absurdity was the reason that logical positivism was abandoned. She just mentions the argument from self-referential absurdity, says that it applies to logical positivism and disproves it, and then quotes William Lane Craig as saying, and it collapsed and it was the most important thing in philosophy in the 20th century. But she doesn't draw any connection between that argument and the fall of logical positivism. It's and I don't know personally. I'm not well versed on the history of the rise and fall of logical positivism, so I don't know if that was the reason that people abandoned it and it lost favor in the philosophical community after a few decades, or if there was some other reason why people decided that it was no longer a school that interested them or that they considered valid or useful. But Nancy Pearcey does not offer any evidence at all that that argument was responsible for the decline in the acceptance and the popularity of logical positivism. She just sort of puts them next to each other and says, see, it works. Also, just to return to Norman Geisler for a second, if you look up when he was in college, which would have been the late 50s through the mid 60s altogether, from when he was an undergraduate to when he was completely finished, you see that his collegiate career was in the waning years of logical positivism's popularity. I would interpret that as meaning that he disproved a philosophy that was already being abandoned, though I imagine Geisler would prefer to frame it differently. Perhaps word of his devastating single-sentence rebuttal spread throughout the philosophical community like ripples stretched ever outward in a pool of water after a stone had been thrown, and as a result of that stone and all of those ripples reaching ever outward, logical positivism was dead in a few years. The man who threw that stone, Norman Geisler, because that's apparently how you discredit a philosophy, pointing out a contradiction with a single sentence. It's just that simple. Anyway, so it's not a cheap rhetorical trick because, according to Pearcey, it works. But the problem isn't with the concept of pointing out self-contradiction. The problem is with how it's done. Again, as I said, I don't know the history of the rise and fall of logical positivism, but something tells me it was a bit more complicated than a bunch of philosophers from other schools constantly repeating, but that statement isn't empirically testable, to logical positivists. Obviously, self-contradiction is a problem for any philosophy, but there's a difference between saying a given worldview is self-contradictory and demonstrating in a comprehensive and compelling way that said worldview actually is unavoidably, unsalvageably self-contradictory. So far, all Pearcey has shown us is the former, not the latter. She's able to point at things and say, contradicts itself, but she's not able or not willing, either because of space issues in the book, or she doesn't want to write that kind of a heavy philosophical book, or she's just not capable of doing it, or she doesn't think she can do it. She's not doing that. She's not showing us the actual work that proves why a given philosophy is irretrievably, unsalvageably, self-referentially absurd. She's just saying it is. For example, Pearcey takes the next few pages to direct the argument from self-referential absurdity at several non-biblical philosophies, apparently disposing of each one in a single sentence, Geisler style, turning their own premises against them with a glib smugness that would make Geisler quite proud, I think. Marxism? Marx said that truth claims are rationalizations of economic interests. So does that mean Marx created his philosophy to rationalize his own economic interests? Checkmate, Marx. How about Nietzsche? If, as he said, all human action is driven by a will to power, does that mean his own will to power drove his actions and therefore we should be dubious of his ideas? Next. Freud, if human behavior results from sexual repression, guess what that means for old Sigmund Freud himself? Denied. How about B.F. Skinner? Sure, why not? Is human behavior the result of conditioned responses? Then why should anyone listen to Skinner, whose theory must be a product of his own conditioning? Oh, in all your faces. No attempt is made to understand or engage with any of the content of these various worldviews. No acknowledgement of the other side, no examination of possible responses to these arguments, no telling whether or not people who hold and defend these various worldviews have responded to the charge that they are self-referentially absurd. Just simplistic, and yes, reductionistic, statements declaring them to be internally contradictory and therefore irrational and therefore invalid. And again, I realize this is not a philosophical text. This is a popular apologetics book, and perhaps it's unfair of me to expect Nancy Pearcey to try to do all this philosophical heavy lifting to explain why these various worldviews are false or self-contradictory. But nonetheless, the fact remains, she does a grave disservice to those philosophies and to philosophy itself by just sort of glibly refuting them and giving her readers the impression that it's just that easy, that these worldviews are just that simple and fragile, that you can just say one sentence, you can just make one observation about them, or just rephrase their premise in a particular way, and they just completely fall apart. This is even more of a mockery of philosophy than creationism is a mockery of science. I'm by no means a philosopher, as I'm sure I have demonstrated repeatedly throughout this series and throughout all of these An Atheist Read series that I have done. I am not a philosopher, nor am I even a philosophy student. But I have never read, nor heard, nor met anyone who cared about philosophy, who has studied it, who has learned enough about it to have their own ideas about it, who would be remotely convinced by this insulting and masturbatory form of argument. You want to make an objection to a philosophical worldview? First, show that you understand it. Don't just rephrase its central premise to make it sound self-defeating and then declare victory and strut away. Unless you're grandstanding for an audience you assume won't know the difference. In which case, have at it and enjoy your hollow simulacrum of intellectual triumph. Oh, this gets better. Pearcey reminds us why the biblical worldview is superior, because it doesn't deify something lower than God. It makes God himself the foundation. Those other worldviews all fail when held up to their own standards. The debunkers debunk themselves. Pearcey says, quote, or they would if they were consistent. To avoid discrediting their own views, the debunkers tacitly exempt themselves from the critique they use to discredit everyone else. They act as if they are not blinded by the same irrational forces that distort and bias everyone else's views. They are mysteriously able to rise above the forces that enslave everyone else. They alone are capable of achieving an untainted insight into reality. They somehow have the power to float above the box, rendering their own theories objectively valid and true. Okay. And a few paragraphs later, she says, quote, by contrast, a Christian worldview is not reductionistic. It does not reduce reason to something less than reason, and therefore it does not self-destruct. A Christian epistemology, theory of knowledge, starts with the transcendent creator who spoke the entire universe into being with his word. John uses a Greek word, logos, which means not only word, but also reason or rationality, the underlying principle that unifies the world into an orderly cosmos, as opposed to randomness and chaos. The Greeks who heard John's gospel understood that he was claiming that Christ is the source of the order and coherence of the universe. So first, she attacks people who act as though they are immune from the biases and other factors that limit and distort the views of other people. She belittles people who think they alone are capable of true insight into reality, and rightly so, I might add. Then, and I mean it is literally 2 paragraphs later, same page, She explains why her own worldview is immune from the biases and limitations of others, and why only she and people who share her worldview do not philosophically self-destruct. But it's different when she does it, because her worldview is based on God, not something lower than God. See? Again, not a rhetorical trick. Makes perfect sense. Logic. This next one will have a familiar ring for many of you. Quote, "The upshot is that all worldviews have to borrow a Christian epistemology, at least at the moments they are making their claims. They must tacitly assume the reliability of reason and rationality, which only a biblical worldview supports. They have to function as if Christianity is true, even as they reject it." Because, you see, when you rely on your reasoning to understand or explain something, you're assuming that your reasoning is valid. But how do you know your reasoning is valid without relying on your reasoning? You can't evaluate your reasoning using your reasoning. That's circular. Suppose you evaluate your reasoning and determine it to be valid. But what if your reasoning in determining your reasoning to be valid was invalid? According to Pearcey, only a biblical worldview explains why our reasoning is trustworthy, because it is grounded in certain facts, which we know from experience, and because our minds, like the world we experience, is a reflection of the mind of God himself. God created the universe to have an intelligible order, and he created our minds the same way. Therefore, we can rely on our reasoning. But this worldview is rooted in the Bible, or at least our understanding of it is rooted in the Bible. Pearcey quotes from Genesis and the Gospel of John in explaining how God created the universe to reflect the perfect rationality of himself and his word. And of course, she quotes repeatedly from the Epistle to the Romans to explain where she gets her 5 principles from. But before we can read and understand those principles found in the Bible, don't we have to trust that our ability to read and comprehend what we read is sufficient to the task and reliable? And even if we say, well, we don't need to read the Bible to know that our reasoning is based on God, because you can see from nature, from general revelation, that there is a God and he created an ordered and intelligible universe. But how do we know that? Don't we experience it through our senses and understand it through our rational minds? What if our reasoning is flawed? What if the reasoning we used to conclude that our reasoning is valid because our minds are created in the image of God is invalid? Pearcey presents Christianity as the one worldview that enables you to justify your reasoning without relying on your reasoning itself. So it's not circular, but that's simply not true. You still need to rely on your reasoning to evaluate the validity of Christianity, just as you do with everything else. The uncertainty as to whether or not we can trust our reasoning is an inescapable philosophical uncertainty that we all have to live with. Pearcey and other presuppositionalists claim they found a way out, a way to justify their reasoning without using their reasoning, but that is a conceit, nothing more. Next, Pearcey turns the, she thinks, awesome power of the argument from self-referential absurdity on evolution, and specifically the notion that the human mind, as it exists today, is a product of natural selection. Under this theory, the mind and our instincts and innate thought patterns were determined by their survival value, not by their ability to tell us what is true. Aha! But what if we applied that theory to itself? What if our minds decided that evolutionary epistemology was true for its survival value rather than its truth? Wouldn't that mean that it wasn't true? No. Pearcey goes on to quote John Gray, who said that if the human mind is the product of natural selection, then it serves evolutionary success rather than truth. She paraphrases Gray as having said, if Darwin's theory is true, then it isn't true, because she interprets serves evolutionary success as meaning not true. But if our brains, like the rest of us, are products of natural selection, that doesn't mean that our brains are incapable of discerning truth or that every idea we come up with is necessarily false. What an absurd, truly warped and self-serving interpretation that is on Pearcey's part. What it means is natural selection favored humans who were the best at staying alive long enough to reproduce, not humans who were the best at finding the truth. Or if you prefer, it favored traits that improved the likelihood of survival rather than traits that improved the ability to discern the truth. For one common example of how that would work, take an instinct that comes to us from much further back on the evolutionary timeline, an instinct that we share with many animals. That is the instinct to flee when we perceive that danger is near. We see animals acting on this instinct throughout nature. We ourselves will sometimes act on this instinct. And this happens whether genuine danger is present or not. If we feel threatened, we are compelled to respond. And sometimes it will turn out later that we only thought we were threatened, but that the danger was illusory. But that doesn't matter. The instinct to flee in the face of a perceived threat became a common trait among animals because those of our ancestors who caught a whiff of danger and ran tended to live longer and produce more offspring carrying on their traits than those of our ancestors who hung around for a few extra seconds to make sure the danger was genuine and got eaten by a predator. The instinct wasn't favored by natural selection because it helped us to detect genuine danger. The instinct was favored by natural selection because it helps us to survive. That doesn't mean we're incapable of detecting genuine danger. That doesn't mean that everything our brains do is for the purpose and the sole purpose of helping us survive, and therefore it's beyond our ability to make sound judgments and accurate predictions based on our experiences and our observations with our evolutionarily determined brains that were made for survival rather than truth-finding. Pearcey goes on to quote Francis Crick, saying that our brains were not evolved in order to discover scientific truth, but rather to enable us to survive. But Pearcey says that means that Crick's theory is not a scientific truth. Again, no, that is not at all what it means. Does it make sense to argue that since a Stilson wrench was designed to turn pipes, it's impossible to use one to drive in a nail? Or since a tennis ball is meant for tennis, you can't possibly play baseball with one? I've played baseball with tennis balls. It's hella fun. It goes forever. You get a good hit on a tennis ball, you'll never see it again. Anyway, our brains have certain attributes. We, as beings, as organisms, have certain attributes. And just because those abilities and attributes weren't evolved because they allowed us to determine scientific truth, doesn't mean they're useless for that purpose. Evolution adapted us for one purpose, but now, as conscious thinking beings, we can adapt ourselves to other purposes. Pearcey argues that science itself is at stake in this argument. She quotes John Lennox as saying that a mind that is the product of evolution could not be trusted because if you knew your computer was the product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it. What? I mean, if I had a computer that was the product of a mindless, unguided process, but it worked, that is, it produced results that were testable, consistent, and reliable, and it operated according to principles that were comprehensible and predictable, and also, by the way, it was the only computer I had, then why the hell wouldn't I trust it? I mean, not trusting something because of where it came from, regardless of its true nature and ability, seems a little prejudiced, doesn't it? Don't be racist towards your computers, folks. Judge them by their merits. Judge them by their abilities. Don't judge them by whether or not they were produced by unintelligent, unguided processes. Shouldn't we be beyond that by now as a species? I would hope so. Pearcey presents several variations on this theme. She argues that if not for Christianity, nothing would make sense. And she says, first, let's talk about science. Without the basis for rationality provided by Christianity, science would be impossible. So you're welcome for science from Christians. Next, she attacks postmodernism. again. She says that postmodernism refutes itself because the postmodernist claim that there is no universal truth is itself a universal truth claim. So if there are no universal truths, that would mean there is no universal truth cannot be a true statement, which means postmodernism collapses into absurdity. Logic. You don't need to study what postmodernists actually believe. You don't need to respond to their actual arguments. You just need to memorize a sentence, and you can demolish their entire worldview. Decades and decades and decades of writing and debating and arguing. Doesn't matter. I can rephrase their premise to make it sound self-refuting. Get rid of it. Must be fun to imagine that you're so much smarter than you actually are. After spending several more pages attacking postmodernism, Pearcey returns to another favorite target, which is diversity. Because remember, from previous chapters, we've learned that not only is she a creationist Christian apologist, she is also a right-wing grouch who hates political correctness and diversity. She says that diversity actually leads to oppression, because those who promote diversity are only interested in certain types of diversity. They're only interested in racial diversity or class diversity or gender or ethnic group or sexual diversity. They don't care about intellectual or political or religious diversity. Actually, she doesn't say religious diversity. She says theological diversity. And why would she not say religious diversity? Perhaps because she, and I'm just speculating here, as a Christian, as the type of Christian that she is, believes her worldview is the only correct one, and therefore she isn't interested in promoting religious diversity, because that would mean sharing space and affording respect to people from non-Christian religions. So she would prefer to speak out in favor of theological diversity, where she would only have to tolerate her fellow Christians. She wouldn't have to put up with any Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Jains or Baha'is or whoever else she might have to share space with at the university because of their precious religious diversity program. Now, and if that's the case, and I don't know if that's the case, but it's tempting to conclude that it is, given her very precise choice of words in complaining about the lack of theological diversity rather than religious diversity, then it strikes me as a bit hypocritical on Pearcey's part. She complains that those who promote diversity only care about certain kinds of diversity, but then she herself avoids mentioning a particular kind of diversity, which I imagine she would be uncomfortable promoting or participating in herself. She also ridicules the notion of achieving diversity by making an effort to be inclusive of oppressed and overlooked groups, dismissing this as Marxism. She really should have a YouTube channel. She really should have a YouTube channel. And remember, Marxism is bad because it's reductionist and it's self-defeating, like all worldviews except Pearcey's Christianity. The thing is, though, all this postmodern stuff is everywhere. So what is a Christian parent to do? How can Christians hope to prepare their pure, innocent Christian children to go out into the world and avoid becoming adults who think for themselves? Now, I mean, avoid abandoning their faith. Quote, "The perfect balance of unity and diversity within the Trinity offers a model for human social life and a solution for the opposing poles of postmodernism and modernism. Against postmodernism's disillusion of the self, the Trinity implies the dignity of the individual self. Just as each person within the Trinity is distinct and plays a unique role in the drama of salvation, so each individual person has a unique identity and purpose." Pearcey goes on to declare that Christianity does not reduce individuals to their communities. Well, these ideas are neither the creation nor the property of Christianity. You don't need to believe in the Trinity to believe that individual people deserve to be treated with respect and to regard their individual identities as important, Nor do you need to be a Christian to recognize that individual identity and community identity must be balanced in order to truly have a sense of who we are. Christian apologists will compulsively take credit for things that their religion did not create and does not own. They can't help themselves because that's all they can do. It's their only option. Steal and then accuse others of stealing from you. Pearcey closes the chapter with this sort of thinking. In fact, quote, "In every area, Christianity encompasses the valid insights of all other worldviews while avoiding their weaknesses. It incorporates the best insights of idol-centered philosophies without falling into any limited life-denying reductionism. This is genuinely good news. In fact, Christianity is so attractive that atheists keep reaching over and borrowing from it." In the past, I've complained about Christians laying exclusive claim to concepts like joy, love, charity, purpose, and then accusing non-Christians of borrowing those concepts for their own use. But I don't think that's what's happening here. Because while we all incorporate ideas about love and charity and purpose and joy and many other things into our lives, I don't think we all justify our reasoning in the way Pearcey says we do when she accuses us of borrowing from Christianity. It's true that I assume my reasoning is valid, generally speaking, but I don't attempt to justify that assumption. I treat that assumption as basic, as something that must be in place before anything else can happen. Pearcey isn't claiming that the concept of valid reasoning belongs to Christianity. I mean, she might believe that too, but she's claiming that only Christianity can explain why our reasoning is valid and can be trusted. But if I don't justify my reasoning, if I assume it's valid because I don't see there being any other choice, then I'm not borrowing from Christianity. I'm trusting that my reasoning is valid because I can't proceed without trusting that my reasoning is valid. And I'm just getting on with it. And even if I wanted to justify my reasoning in some way, I couldn't borrow that justification from Christianity because Christianity offers no such justification. Pearcey and other presuppositionalists claim that it does, but it doesn't, for reasons that I've already gone over in this video and elsewhere. Why do apologists like Pearcey say our reasoning is justified? Because our brains are made in the image of the perfectly rational God. And how do they know that? Is it in their brains? Can they know it without it being in their brains? Can they just know whether or not the statement, our reasoning is justified because we are made in the image of God, is true or not without utilizing their brains? No. Then their worldview is no more able to justify their reasoning without becoming trapped in circular logic than any other. And that being the case, I would kindly invite them all to take a seat. And now I myself will be taking a seat on this subject anyway for the next week. And then I will be back next week to finish this little journey through finding truth. We will look at the final two sections of the book. First, we'll look at the next chapter, which is titled Principle Number 5, Freeloading Atheists. And then we will look at part 3, which is just a single chapter, and it is titled How Critical Thinking Saves Faith. And we will conclude our examination of this book in that video. So please join me next week for the conclusion of the Finding Truth series. Thank you, as always, for watching. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your feedback. If you have anything to say in response to anything I have had to say in this video, something I got wrong, something you think I got right, something you think needs to be expanded on, something you have a different perspective on, anything I've had to say in this video, if you have anything to say in response, please do leave a comment. Also, if you enjoyed this, you got something out of this, please like this video, share it, subscribe to my channel if you're not subbed already, and please consider helping me to make more videos like this one and all the other ones that I do, and also helping me to, pay my bills and stuff by becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of my Patreon campaign and help me continue to do this work that I really enjoy doing, and hopefully a lot of you get something out of. And if you pledge at a level of $1 a month, that helps me out tremendously. If you pledge at a higher level than $1 a month, if you pledge at $5 a month or more, you get some extra perks. And one of the perks you get if you pledge at $5 a month, is you get to get a sneak peek at the scripts for these An Atheist Reads videos the day before the videos go up. So you get a written document of my arguments, of my notes for the video that you can look at, that you can read, or you can follow along with as you watch the video. I know that a few of you have taken advantage of that and have expressed your appreciation to me for that. I'm really grateful that it has been of use to some of you. So consider doing that if you can afford it, if you think I'm worth it. $5 a month, you get a sneak peek at the scripts for the videos. Anyway, that's it for me, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.